So our fourth dialogue today is on how to make our elected leaders more representative of women, racial minorities, and our full diversity with Cynthia Terrell and Michele Jawando. Cynthia is a founder of Fair Vote and chairs our Representation 2020 project. She has served as a board member of the American Friends Service Committee and Sandy Springs Friends School. Michele Jawando is the Vice President for Legal Affairs at American Progress. Previously, she served as General Counsel and Senior Advisor to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and as the National Campaign Manager for Election Protection at the People for the American Way. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Michele. So I'll just start off chatting, and then Michele and I agreed backstage that we're going to be engaged and dynamic and interrupting each other and complimenting each other all the way. So I'll just start out saying I've had a little a Facebook message thread going with some other activists around the country, lamenting the phraseology of Black History Month. And it reminded me that we are approaching Women's History Month as well, upcoming in March. And both of those things obviously share a common word, history. That's the past. And I think the thing that we really need to embrace, and I hope all of you leave this conference with, is a sense of what the future can be and needs to be. We often talk about it as though American democracy could be better and representation isn't all that it could be. But I would submit to all of you that there's an urgent need to figure out how to make our American democracy more representative broadly. And I care about ideological minorities, people who are unrepresented in Manhattan and unrepresented in rural Oklahoma. But my particular focus is on how to get more women elected and how to get more people of color elected and how to engage in a meaningful conversation about the kinds of systems changes that we can work on collectively in a coordinated way to support one another in really creating a new conversation about how to get to gender parity in our lifetimes. As Anne-Marie said, at the current rate of change, though the algorithms differ, it's well beyond any of our lifetimes. I'm making an assumption here, that we'll reach gender parity in elected office. And I think that one only needs to look to the Senate, to the House of Representatives, to local elected bodies all over the country to see that people of color are vastly unrepresented in proportion to their numbers. And it's not that they don't understand the system or they're not good speakers or they're not well trained. They're really systematic things that make it hard for certain demographic groups to win and succeed in our American democracy. So I think that we agree there are a whole handful of things that we need to work on, and I'd be really glad to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Right. So first off, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to you being here who believe that kind of the greatest pieces of our democracy is this kind of constant engagement and questioning. So I will probably start there with how do we kind of change representation as we know it? There are a few things. Culturally, we have to believe that it's possible, right? So if you are a young woman, if you are a person of color in this country, and you look at the United States Congress, you look at local elected state legislatures, and you see one or two, and people say, oh, look how great and diverse Congress is. We now have 2 African-American senators. Woo! Right?
We're really done.
You know, this is the most diverse Congress ever. We have 20 women in the Senate. Woo! Right? And so it's just kind of like, okay, well, that's really not it. So there has to we must first question why we think that those half measures are okay. Because something in our psyche has said if we get 1 or 2 people in place, then that's all right, and that we've won and we're successful and we've done something. And so we first have to kind of question why we think that's all right, and it's not. The second piece, and I think Fair Vote and so many others today have talked about, there are real structural barriers that are in place. So whether you talk about just single member districts, how you kind of change some of those areas, when you think about as we're dealing with this post-Shelby situation, we know that if we've seen, and there are now all these empirical studies to show us, if there are more women and minorities turning out in a state, We now know that that state is much more likely to move forward with a voter ID law, restricting early voting, changing rules around provisional ballots. We put out a paper on this where we basically ranked the states and how awful they were on some of these measures at the Center for American Progress. So we know that even just the idea of greater representation scares people. And if we're being quite candid today, and I want to be, we have to recognize that those are kind of cultural conversations that we have to have. We have to talk about our social interactions with one another, and we have to say that it's okay. You know, we have a program at CAP called Progress 2050, and we think that kind of greater representation is a good thing, right? Because we're going to get a diversity of voices. There are more people who will represent different experiences. But in kind of setting that stage and telling people, we have to tell the masses, and disproportionately, we have to tell our white brothers and sisters that it's okay that the world gets a little black and browner. And it's a tough thing to say, right? But those are the things that we have to do. And I think when we start having some of those kind of real conversations, and we think about both systems, we think about culture, we can make some real change.
I think that's a great point. One of the things the earlier keynote speaker addressed was the fact that I think it was by 2050, forgive me if I have that time wrong, that we'll be majority minority. And so certainly by then, I will hope, let's pledge that we'll figure this out, because that it's painful now to watch. But I think that the shifting demographic reality of the globe has meant that other countries, I know we're not supposed to talk about the rest of the world, but we live on a globe with other countries, and they use other processes, shall we say, that there are all kinds of different innovative ways to ensure representation that are fair and reflect the will of the voters in whatever area it is. I like to give the example sometimes of the African National Congress when Mandela was first running, and I think it's common sense to think that they got 62% of the vote, and that translated into roughly that percentage of the seats. And we're not talking about that kind of a voting system, but we do want to have that conversation about what kinds of rules changes we can be making here in this country to deliver some more of that reflective representation.
So let me give a great example. So I had the honor and privilege of working for Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and started in the Senate when she began her Senate career. There were a few practical problems that we had to deal with. So my boss was one of the youngest members ever elected. She had 2 young kids. On the Senate floor, you are not allowed, when you're voting, to bring your children onto the Senate floor, right? You're not even supposed to keep them in what's called the cloakroom, which is an area where the senators gather before the votes. So if I have a young senator with 2 young kids who needs to be there for very late votes, then I have a practical problem, because what does she do with her children? I mean, what did we do? So we were creative, right? So we had to figure out, okay, could we find a babysitter to come and do this? Could the babysitter meet us by the floor and take the kids, and then the senator would meet her someplace to pick up the kids? I mean, we had issues that Chuck Schumer will never know. And these are just kind of real problems that, you know, the senator is fortunate. She's in a different class of her own. She can afford the babysitter. But what do we say to the working women, to low and middle class mothers who have to figure out what they do with their children when they're sick or when they change the hours that they need to be at work? So that's the problem. And then some of the answers are things that will help everybody, that will help more men who are more and more engaged in caregiving. And I love that, especially as the mom of 3 young children. I love when my husband is like, totally there, and he's like, they added this meeting when I'm supposed to pick up the girls. Like, he feels the pain, right? We have to talk about what are some of the policy solutions that will help. So paid sick leave, right? We need to have paid FMLA. We need to think about childcare in these countries. These are very practical policy solutions that have and mean something for our elected officials. We can't say we need more women in Congress, but we don't make allowances for their families. We can't say we need more men to step up and be caregivers, and we don't make allowances for the men who want to go and be a caregiver for their families.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's Representation 2020 is a project that works in coalition with all of the great organizations that are working collectively on this issue of gender parity. And we focus on 3 specific structural things that we think would make a big difference. And one of them is just exactly what Michele is describing, the kinds of legislative measures and practices within any kind of a body that make it possible for women to serve and lead effectively. And that has issues for pay and distance from the legislative, the House, and how far people have to travel. All of those things are really important. So we are in the process of doing more research and understanding what are those good kinds of policies, both legislative and internal rules that a legislature can agree upon. The other thing that, the other 2 things that we focus on are the kinds of recruitment practices around what are parties and gatekeepers and donors doing to ensure that as many women and candidates of color are nominated and recruited to run for office. That's something where we see a real area of potential growth for more diversity of candidacies if parties and others had some suggested legislation and resolutions and things they could follow to say we are going to try to aim for 50% of our candidates that we recruit in a state are going to be women. And some of them are going to be women of color, some of them are going to be men of color. So that recruitment piece we think is very important. And then the third thing is we've talked about and you've heard about today are these voting systems, the ranked choice voting system and the fair representation voting system, both of which seem just conclusively to really help in the election of women. And it's a win-win-win. It helps women, it helps people of color, it helps ideological diversity. So
right. And I mean, and the other piece that I will add here is this conversation that we have to have around money and politics, right? So we recognize that there are structural barriers in place for women and people of color who may not have the same access to the donors and quote unquote those gatekeepers who open the door to elected office. And so as we're thinking about this, we have to recognize there isn't going to be one thing that's the panacea. Right? I'm sorry if that's what you thought. I'm going to hurt your feelings, right? There are a number of systems we have to talk about, right? And the money and politics piece is a huge portion. We have to talk about the structural barriers and how we can continue to kind of change the conversation about what's possible. We also have to talk about, and I know earlier today there was a great panel, we have to disrupt the system to the extent that we are okay with the fact that we haven't been able to do anything about the VRA. That's a problem. Right? We could have never imagined. In 2006, I was working with Greg on trying to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and it was 100 to 0 that we were able to pass a reauthorization of the VRA. But the conversation has changed. We've let people off the hook, and we've made them feel like it's okay. And I'm not saying that the VRA is all there is, but it is significant for so many reasons because it works on these structural issues that we deal with across the country. The other thing, and I'm going to continue to encourage and say this, tear up our notions, these kind of prejudices and implicit bias we may have about who should be in elected office. Right? Challenge the gatekeepers, challenge the donors, challenge the communities that you're all going to go back to today and speak to. And don't just talk about elected officials, let's talk about judges, let's talk about the legal profession, let's talk about the medical profession, because it is all interconnected. And to the extent that we're having these conversations with all of the different communities that we represent, all of the different work that we're doing, it makes a difference. And I promise you we're going to see something better by 2050, because I have 3 amazing little girls who will disrupt the system. If I can't do it, they're going to do it.
Hear, hear. One of the questions that people say frequently, I would say the naysayers, I'm sure none of you fit that category in this crowd, they often say, well, how are sitting politicians going to give up their own power? Why would they possibly want to do that? And the easy rejoinder is that each expansion of suffrage, as Keith Ellison said this morning, and much more eloquently, I'm sure, each expansion of suffrage has happened from the group who were sitting in power. So we can't somehow give away that expectation, as Michele has said, that the people in power, it's not that there are a bunch of bad individuals. They are trying to survive in what I would say is a bad voting system and a bad system overall. So we need to help them. We have an opportunity to help them realize that expansion of suffrage, that expansion of meaningful representative democracy. So I think it's a great opportunity.
Let's get to work.
That sounds good.
Thanks, everybody.